Coming up next, Book TV presents Afterwards, an hour-long program where we invite guest hosts to interview authors. This week, former New York Times reporter Chris Hedges discusses his new book, Empire of Illusion, which describes what he considers to be the economic, political, and moral collapse of American culture. The Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist travels through the world of pro wrestling, academia, and others to dissect the state of illusion he sees in the U.S. Chris Hedges discusses his book with Pulitzer Prize-winning author Ron Suskind.
Hi, I'm Ron Suskind, and I'm here with Chris Hedges, and we're going to talk about Chris's latest book, Empire of Illusion, a provocatively titled piece of work. Chris, I've been following your stuff for years. Lots of people have. You've had a very, very interesting decade. We can talk a little about that, just to sort of alert people as to your journey, because I think this book seems to represent to me a next and important step in your journey as a writer, reporter. You do a lot of reporting in this book, but also now as kind of a public intellectual, a guy who's ready to step up into the hot lights and into the fire. Tell me how you arrive at this book. At some point you had a leap from the tub moment and said, this is the book I must write. When was that? How did it occur?
Well, as you know, Ron, I was out of the country for 20 years, and changes that occurred during those 2 decades, which were rather dramatic. I left in the early 80s and did not come back to live in the country until around after the events of 9/11. So the changes within the country were particularly stark, which had been gradual. The destruction, especially of former manufacturing centers, was a personal revelation, because most of my family comes from very blue-collar towns in Maine, which are as devastated as most manufacturing centers. So that deterioration was particularly marked and particularly troubling. I had watched, of course, the projection of American power abroad, in Latin America, in the Middle East, particularly, and matched that with the perception of American power, and understood that deep disparity. I think I grasped, because of my time outside the country, our deterioration economically, certainly militarily, and the trouble we were in, and set out to really explore many of these illusions, which are sustained within the heart of the American empire, but as one gets to the farthest reaches of the empire, become hollow, if not obscene.
Yeah, so these seeds are planted long ago in you. I think that's sort of interesting here, because you can see the growth in your voice in this book. You know, you're quite a bit more strident. You're saying, look, I'm going to call it just as exactly as it is, and it's not a topic-driven thing as some of your other books, The Christian Right or what have you.
Right.
You know, you're going for the whole thing here,
Right.
Edge to edge, shoreline to shoreline. And it's interesting because, you know, what's it, that Gibran line, it's easy to see the mountain from the plain sometimes, and when you're climbing it, you're not on the mountain, you're overseas, you're turning to see America, and you are maybe graced with some insights, maybe even against your will, as to how the U.S. projects power, as to the gap between ideals and actions. When you get back, I'm sure there was sort of almost a dislocation you felt as you're walking deeply right into the breach of that.
Well, especially after 7 years in the Middle East, and I'm an Arabic speaker, the disconnect between our cultural perception of the Middle East, Islam, the Muslim world, and the demonization in so many parts of our society of the Muslim world was deeply disturbing to somebody who has a great deal of affection for many of the countries that and certainly the cultures that I became intimate with. So yeah, I think that there were, on so many levels, so many disparities, that is what led me to write the book.
I just want to do one little digression, because, you know, here you're an established prize-winning reporter for the New York Times, right at the heart of the MSM, the mainstream media, the kind of job people kill to get. But late 2002, early 2003, you kind of stepped off the grid into the breach. You were very ardent about your opposition to the Iraq War. Just tell us a very short précis on that moment where you stepped up. I think it's kind of dramatic at that commencement. Was it at Rockford?
Rockford College.
What happened?
Well, I had published a book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning,
Right.
which was a reflection on war, the poison that war is and what it does to individuals as well as societies. So I had a kind of national platform on various shows, and inevitably I would be asked about the preparations to invade Iraq. Now, I've spent months of my life in Iraq, 7 years, as I mentioned, within the Middle East itself, and I understood, like most Arabists, including the Arabists in the State Department, friends of mine, the intelligence community, and the Pentagon, that invading and occupying Iraq and expecting to be greeted as liberators or have democracy implanted and emanate outwards across the Middle East was a non-reality-based belief system. It was utopian in the way Thomas More used the word utopia, no place. We don't think of Dick Cheney as a utopian, but in that sense he was. And so I spoke.
He'd be delighted to hear that you think so.
Well, utopianism wedded to violence has caused more genocides in human history than.
Yeah, sure.
And I knew I had a choice. I mean, I'd been almost 15 years with the New York Times. I knew that for a news reporter, and I was a news reporter, not a columnist, to speak out against policy was a career killer. Yet on the other hand, I felt that there were so few people who had that platform, coupled with the experience and expertise, that it was incumbent upon me, a kind of moral choice, and I didn't go to journalism school, I went to seminary, to warn about the debacle that we have now, of course, stumbled into. And so this made the paper uncomfortable, but it came to a flashpoint, as you mentioned, when I gave a commencement address where I was had my microphone cut twice and was booed, and people, at one point the crowd stood and began singing God Bless America, and people were weeping, and then finally at the end of 18 minutes of my talk, 2 young men from the class actually climbed up onto the podium to try and push me off of it. Campus security escorted me out of the ceremony before the awarding of diplomas. They didn't want the students to come up. And then this got picked up by the usual Rush Limbaugh and company, and your former paper, the Wall Street Journal, wrote a really nasty editorial about me, and the Times had to respond, and they responded by issuing me a formal written reprimand. We were gilled, which means that then goes into your file. I was told to stop. I had impugned the impartiality of the paper. I was to stop speaking out about the war, and then, of course, after that warning, which is in a formal warning, then I would, the next time I did it, I would be fired. So I started making arrangements to leave the paper at that point.
You know, it's interesting because, you see a crossroads moment there for you, and I just am trying to feel what it must have felt like for you to be in front of that crowd. I've been in front of a lot of crowds and done commencements and whatnot. That's quite a moment, and, especially for a person seasoned in the reportage, in the reporting trades, to be there right at the center of that sort of anger, that urgency, really. But in a way, a door closes and another one clearly opened for you. I mean, and that is this incredible sort of offering of books. You've been very busy since then. And are you sleeping, 3-4 hours a night? It's pretty.
I don't have much of a life outside of that.
It's a pretty astonishing output. How many books have you written since you left the Times?
7.
7, yeah. That's then you leave the Times in 2003.
A little after that, but yeah.
Okay. All right. So you are putting out.
Although I had written the Wars of Force while I was at the paper. So.
Yeah, but still, you're about at a book a year.
Right.
And I think this. Let's get right to Empire of Illusion. This is really a capstone. Tell me, for someone walking in the door, what is this book about, and why is it so urgent that this book needed to be written by you at this moment?
Because I think we are the most deeply illusioned society on the planet. One strives towards dreams. One lives within illusions. And you can see it on innumerable examples, but let's just take the last presidential election. Here we were, a country that not only under international law were waging a doctrine of preemptive war, which under post-Nuremberg laws are defined as illegal wars of aggression. We were running offshore penal colonies where we openly tortured people detained without any rights.